Welcome to Kids Doc Talk with Dr. Jennie. Today's guest is Dr. Jacob Seligsohn talking about vaccine hesitancy. Dr. Seligsohn is from Brooklyn, New York, and received his bachelor's degree in biology and psychology from Binghamton University. He received his medical degree from Sackler School of Medicine and completed his pediatric residency at the Schneider Children's Hospital in Long Island. He is board certified by the American Board of Pediatrics. Dr. Seligsohn is currently the Assistant Lead Physician at Pediatric Associates Emerald Woods Office, the Chair of the Pediatric Associates Committee on Education, and the Regional Lead Physician for South Florida. He is a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the former President of Broward County Pediatric Society. Dr. Seligsohn is fluent in both English and Hebrew and enjoys working out, racquetball, and playing table tennis. Welcome, Dr. Seligsohn.
Welcome to Kids Doc Talk with Dr. Jennie. Dr. Jennie is a board-certified pediatrician and is the Director of Telemedicine at Pediatric Associates.
Hi, Dr. Seligsohn. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Hello, Dr. Berkovich. How are we today?
I'm good. So I'm very excited to talk about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. It's a great topic, an important topic, and I think one that as pediatricians we have sort of gotten very used to and very comfortable with, but something that our adult counterparts, I think we're often facing for the very first time with COVID and with the COVID vaccine. So first, I guess, tell me a little bit about like your experience and like what you've seen with vaccine hesitancy in your patient. Is this in your patient population? Is this a common issue for you?
Well, thank goodness it's not very common. It's in a small percentage of patients because the term vaccine hesitancy is really a term that describes a very small minority of patients. Most patients and parents have vaccine confidence, which either comes from their own personal research or the pediatrician, with, of course, the emphasis on what we'd like, which is a parent getting their information from their child's pediatrician. There is always social media, the internet, other literature, other resources. But when a parent gets their vaccine information and thus vaccine confidence from their friendly neighborhood pediatrician, it carries with it more credibility and more weight, because unfortunately with the internet world we live in today, there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of disinformation. So we just want to always be sure that the information that parents are getting is accurate, correct, and will ultimately provide the best benefit and health benefit for their children.
So where did this idea even come from? Like, what is the background behind vaccine hesitancy? Because we'll talk about some of the myths, but let's take a step back and from like a historical perspective. Where did these myths even sort of originate?
I can't say I'm 100% sure where it originated, but I can tell you anecdotally from what parents tell me, because I personally obviously believe very passionately, very strongly in vaccines. It's just maybe the idea of injecting something into a child, a healthy child, with the idea that it's going to produce some benefit while the child was healthy anyway. So I think part of the hesitancy comes from the fact of the old saying, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. But sometimes what parents don't realize is the world we live in today is only the reason that it exists the way it does because of mass vaccination, meaning we take a lot for granted. The reason things are so hunky-dory and healthy and we're not seeing meningitis and polio and measles is because we make everyone get the vaccine and we encourage everyone to get their children vaccinated. That's why things are the way they are. So I'm not sure where it started, but when we talk about anecdotal evidence and then vaccine hesitancy opposed by vaccine confidence, I often just give the parent the stories I've heard, because when I came to Pediatric Associates back in 2006, about 16 short years ago, I had the privilege and benefit to work with a bunch of physicians in the Hollywood office that were much more senior and seasoned with 20, 30, or even 40 plus years experience. And they would tell me that in their early training and their beginning of practice years, their early years, they were spinal tapping kids for meningitis left and right before the late 1980s and early 90s when mass vaccination for the meningitis shots came out. And they were living proof that vaccines made a difference. Before the vaccines, lots of kids got meningitis and required a spinal tap, which for those who don't know is a needle about yay big, inserted right into the child's lower back to look for brain infection. Once vaccines came out in the late 80s, early 90s, the incidence of meningitis dropped drastically to a fraction of a percent. So that's my full, complete answer for you.
Okay, so you mentioned the term misinformation, which I think we'll repeat over and over because a lot of vaccine hesitancy is rooted, right, in misinformation. So what are some common myths that you have heard about vaccines? Because I wanted to spell it, at least a few of them.
Yeah, sure. The biggest myths that I've heard, there's probably three of them. One is that there's chemicals or preservatives in the vaccines that are harmful, which of course they are not, which I'll get into. The other myth would be there's too many vaccines at once and it's going to overload the child's immune system, which of course, as I'll point out in a little bit, that it surely won't. And the third is another common myth. Number three is that vaccines were somehow possibly linked with autism, which of course it was proven not to be linked with autism. So those are the three.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each one of those.
Sure. So the first myth is that there are certain harmful or potentially harmful preservatives in vaccines. The biggest one people talked about was mercury. So let me just say that there's different kinds of mercury. We all saw the movie, or some of us did, with Julia Roberts, Erin Brockovich, where they had chromium in the water and there was a lawsuit. And it was shown that there's different kinds of chromium, some of which is very harmful, some of which is not harmful at all. So it's the same with mercury. There are two basic kinds of mercury that we're dealing with. They sound similar, but chemically and biologically, they are very different. So one of them is methylmercury, that starts with the letter M. That's the mercury that's found in tuna. So when a mom's or a mother's OBGYN says you shouldn't eat or consume a lot of tuna because of the mercury buildup, they're absolutely right. Pregnant women should not consume a lot of tuna because of the methylmercury content, which could be harmful. And I agree with that 100%. The mercury that was found in vaccines, which in any event was largely removed in the late 1990s by the year 2000, just as a precaution over 2 decades ago, was safe. It was called ethyl mercury that starts with an E, not methyl mercury that starts with an M. Ethyl mercury, chemically and biologically in the body, is very different. It passes through the body very quickly. It's not harmful. And the term for the ethyl mercury as a preservative in the vaccine is thimerosal. Almost all the vaccines have thimerosal or ethyl mercury removed because in the late 1990s, as a precaution, while it was being investigated, the thought was just to remove it in any event. So it was removed. But since the late 90s or 2000, had mercury or ethyl mercury, thimerosal, been harmful, we would have expected that the rate of autism would have gone down in the last 20 years because the mercury was removed from the shots, right? However, it didn't. The rate of autism has been steady or is actually even a little bit higher with the broad diagnosing criteria. So clearly that in and of itself proves two things. The ethyl mercury that was in the vaccines is safe. And number two, it couldn't have been linked to any neurological issues because the rate of autism went up even after the mercury was removed from the shots in the late 90s. So that was the first one about chemicals. Another chemical that is sometimes brought to my attention in practice, Jennie, is aluminum. So the parents often ask, why is there aluminum in the vaccines? Well, aluminum is what we call an adjuvant. It actually enhances the reactivity of the vaccines and helps them work a little better, especially the tetanus shot. Other things that are in vaccines that are not exactly what they appear to be as presented by the internet, I've seen and heard everything, that there's antifreeze in the vaccines, that there's other harmful chemicals.
Stem cells. That's another one I hear about.
Stem cells, right? Yeah, aborted fetuses.
Yeah.
Like there's a blender, we're just taking the fetus, putting him in the blender, mixing it up and injecting it, right? So no, none of that is accurate at all, and it's all categorically inaccurate. So the preservatives are in vaccines so they can last longer, because some of the vaccines are not a single vial. They are what we call multi-vial and get used repeatedly, and we don't want the vaccines to spoil, so that's why there are preservatives in the vaccines. There's preservatives in the food we eat: hot dogs, hamburgers, pasta, pizza, juices, everything, Gatorade. So when a parent questions why are there preservatives in a vaccine, I just simply answer they're there to protect it so it doesn't spoil. And there are preservatives in all the food you eat and all the drinks you drink. So they're really no different. It's the same as having a couple of hot dogs with the preservatives that are in there, which of course, as we know, is harmless, and everyone loves a good hot dog or a slice of pizza. The second biggest myth that I see is the fact that it may be thought initially, when a parent sees the amount of injections a child receives, 3 or 4, that, hey, wait a second, can the body really handle all those vaccines at once when a baby's young, at a 2-month age, or 4 months, or a year? And the answer is yes. Studies show that the body and the body's immune system of a healthy infant can handle thousands of immunogenic hits at once, or thousands of vaccines at once. So of course, we would never inject a child hundreds or thousands of times. The most that we could ever inject a child, even if they're way behind, is 8 times. There's only 8 total vaccines that could be given at once. So with that, it's always important to point out to people that it's not the vaccine or the injection or the needle that stresses the immune system. In medical terms, something we don't always bring up to parents are what we call antigenic epitopes. So those are basically the markers on each vaccine that's injected that stimulate the immune system. So going back decades, we had the initial vaccine, just one. All we had was one. It was smallpox. And the smallpox, in and of itself, yes, was only one vaccine. That's true. But it stimulated the immune system, let's say, a couple of hundred times. So the immune system got taxed or hit a couple of hundred times. Fast forward to today, 2022, we're giving 3, 4, 5, 6 shots at once. The total combined hits on the immune system was maybe 40 or 50. So it's still, even when you give all the shots at once, it's a fraction or a quarter of the total hits or stress on the immune system than many decades ago, even though they only gave one shot. So yeah, the immune system can definitely handle many shots at once. The other example I give is that compared to all the viruses that a child is exposed to walking into pediatric associates in the waiting room or just outside, the 3 or 4 shots that our nurse is giving is just a teardrop in the little bucket or a drop in the ocean compared to what the immune system is exposed to on a daily basis. So if the baby or child can handle living and breathing the outside air, exposed to dozens and dozens and hundreds of germs in the air all at once, or every little thing a child touches and puts in their mouth every 2 seconds, the 3 or 4 vaccines a nurse is administering during a well check is really, really minuscule and minute compared to the stress on the immune system anyway. The third myth that we, thank goodness, less frequently hear now is the possible or historic vaccine, MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, autism story. I'll call it a story because what had happened was, and what a lot of people may not know, is there was a scientist in Great Britain, in England, by the name of Dr. Andrew Wakefield. Now, he published a study in 1998 claiming that there might be a link. He didn't say there was. He said there's a theoretical link between the MMR vaccine and autism. So a few things about that right off the bat. The study he did took about 12 or 13 kids from his own child's birthday party, and he offered them some reward to take their blood sample. Completely not scientific and unethical. Number 2, he was discovered to be patenting a new MMR, a new measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. So it would be in his financial best interest to maybe slam the original one. So that's what happened. He was found guilty of fraud and taking bribes. And it was so bad that he was sent out of England, out of Great Britain. He was kicked out. He lost his medical license there. He couldn't practice. He came to Melbourne, Florida, and he also did some things in Texas, right here in the good old USA. But he lost his license because of fraud and because of medical, I don't want to call it misconduct, but clearly unethical studies. So that in and of itself speaks volumes. I always tell parents, if you question it, Google Dr. Andrew Wakefield fraud. Everything will come right up, and everything he stood for and backed up with the MMR autism link.
And that original study that he published, right, was subsequently retracted due
I was
to
just going to say,
all of that, right? And due
yeah,
to some fraudulent data that he submitted.
Yeah, and you took the words right out of my mouth. First of all, a lot of the authors of the study who co-authored it retracted their statement. Subsequently, absolutely, the study, which doesn't happen often to scientific studies, was so bad and determined to be so unethical and so unreliable, it was just pulled right out of the medical journals and medical literature. So you can't even find it anymore. That's how bad it was. It was like reading a comic book. So what I always tell parents is, with measles, mumps, and rubella, the vaccine's given when a child's a year old. At a year old, we expect a child to speak, same at 15 or 18 months. So if they're not doing that, one could possibly think that, hey, they just got the MMR shot last week. Maybe they're not talking because of that. When in reality, A had nothing to do with B, even though B came after A. It's like I say, if you bought the child a tricycle or a coloring book for his first birthday and then he stopped talking, would you blame the tricycle or the coloring book? I don't think you would. So with that, I always say that just because two things happen close in time, it certainly doesn't mean that one caused the other. And sometimes parents think, hey, my child was developing perfectly, and then they got a vaccine and then they regressed. Well, there are regressive neurological conditions well documented in the medical literature long before mass vaccination. We've got a bunch of them. One of them is Rett syndrome, and the other is regressive autism, which is about 15% of autistic kids. Those kids are expected to develop normally up until 12, 15, 18, or even 24 months. And then, just by the nature of their neurological impairment, they go backwards and regress developmentally, irrespective of the shots and the vaccines. Nothing to do with them. It's just the way some
But
of the...
it's just timed that way, right? So somebody who's just looking at that correlation may think that, right, there's a cause and effect there.
Yeah, but there's clearly not. I can actually give a testimonial of one of my patients from 2008 or 2009, where the mother was vaccine hesitant. She delayed the MMR shot till the child was 3. Now, he was speech delayed. He wasn't talking. We can't blame the MMR because he never got it. I got a phone call that she had done the MMR shot in our plantation office as a shot-only visit when the child was 3. And miraculously, the child started talking. So the MMR shot cured her child's speech.
It must have been the vaccine.
Right, it must have been the vaccine. So I told her, as much as I'd like to say the MMR vaccine cured her child's speech delay and developmental delay, it was just time. It happened because it happened, and he just started talking. The dam broke and the verbiage came out, and he verbally exploded at 3. But a perfect example in the exact reverse case of how A comes after B, but it doesn't mean that one caused the other.
So I love that. I want to go back to the second category of myths where sometimes parents are thinking that it's too much, right? We give so many, and in that first year, if you look at the vaccine schedule, gosh, it really is a lot of shots. So why do we have to do it like that? And why are there so many recommended vaccines during that really critical first 12 months?
Well, that's kind of the point. You are most susceptible to get hit badly with these severe illnesses like whooping cough, meningitis, when you're a baby in the first year or two. So you want to make sure, as young as the child is in infancy, they're given the vaccine repeatedly, over and over, to build up their immunity to it, because a lot of the things that they can contract at that age can hit them a lot harder than they would an older child. So that's why we give so much early on. And as time goes on and more studies come out and we have more data about more diseases, we're able to protect children to a higher degree. Give more vaccines, give more protection as time goes on. I know in my career, as I started, I came across the hepatitis A vaccine, the HPV vaccine around 2006 and 7. Didn't exist before, but protects against hepatitis A and cervical cancer. So these are good things. They're not bad. So in my humble opinion, and most physicians' humble opinion, more is better with vaccines. The more protection we get on board, the better.
Sure. So I've had some families and probably some people who are going to be listening to this who are going to say, I'm not vaccine hesitant. I'm not anti-vax, right? I'm not anti-vax, but I just want to space them out. It's just too many shots. I'm going to get all of them, but I don't really need to follow the recommended schedule. I'm going to space them out a little bit and just do, one at a time, two at a time. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can tell you my general thoughts that I don't recommend it because in the time it takes to space something out, the child is not getting that vaccine. So they're just susceptible because they're young. So you're just increasing the window for them to get a serious illness. Of course, I can couple that with another anecdotal story. Going back to 2007, I had a family, 4 children, and 3 out of the 4 were autistic. So clearly autism is something genetic because it's more common in boys with the Y chromosome, not girls. So clearly there's a genetic component. As I just said, it ran in families. This family refused vaccines initially, and they wanted to start, but they wanted to space things out. So they said maybe they'll start with the chickenpox vaccine in a month. So that was the best I can do with that family because the children had received nothing up until that point. In that month, all 4 kids got chickenpox, right? 3 of which were autistic. So again, it wasn't the MMR shot because they're unvaccinated. And when they got the chickenpox, they all 3, because they were delayed, scratched the wounds because they were very itchy, all got cellulitis. And 1 out of the 3 needed IV antibiotics. The other 2 got away with oral antibiotics. An unnecessary and avoidable circumstance that could have been prevented had they just got the vaccine. The other thing I told the parents is now that they've got the chicken pox, it's going to hide and live in their nerves. And when they're older, they can get what we call zoster or shingles, which is extremely painful. And it's not something you want to get. So case in point, delaying it just opens the window to get something. And it happened to that family.
And I would couple that with my own unfortunate anecdote of having worked as a hospital pediatrician and seeing kids get admitted with vaccine preventable diseases and unfortunately get very, very sick and require ventilation, specifically with things like whooping cough or pneumococcal disease, which can really be neurologically devastating and have unfortunate consequences. So there's a reason we have the vaccine schedule, right?
Exactly. And the schedule exists for a reason, and it's based on data. The schedule just didn't come out of thin air. Tons and tons of research and testing on thousands of individuals and participants in scientific studies yield the vaccine schedule that ultimately the CDC and AAP came out with. It exists for a reason. And basically, the idea that vaccines are not necessary is completely false. I mean, just like you said, I have personally seen children with whooping cough turn blue and stop breathing. I've seen the rare case of meningitis, pneumococcal meningitis, where kids have gone to the pediatric ICU. And sometimes parents say, well, my kid's healthy, he's breastfed, he takes a vitamin, his immune system's strong. That's all great for prevention and general state of well-being for a regular virus, but not for these horrific things that we've seen. Breastfeeding and a vitamin will do nothing against polio, meningitis, or whooping cough. Absolutely not. The same way they do nothing for the regular viruses in daycare, where we see once a child goes into daycare, they get sick anyway, whether they were breastfed or not, or whether they're on a multivitamin or not. Sometimes parents also tell me, I'll tell you, I've heard or I've read vaccines don't work. Well, I tell them, honestly, there's 2 to 3% of individuals that are what we call non-responders. That means you give the vaccine, their immune system either doesn't respond or is a little weaker. It doesn't respond the way we want it to fully, completely to the vaccine. we don't routinely test every child's immune system after they get the vaccine. So we have no idea who these non-responders are, these 2 or 3%. So basically, we need to vaccinate everybody, because if he's vaccinated and he's vaccinated and everyone is, there's much less of a chance for anything to spread. Whereas if people exist in the community, 2 or 3%, and they're not responders, they are the few people that are susceptible to disease, and they need to be protected. The same way grandparents and the elderly need to be protected, people who are on chemotherapy or immune suppressed, people on chronic steroids for rheumatoid arthritis or Crohn's disease, all these people are immune suppressed, and we need to vaccinate everyone else to make sure that those susceptible individuals don't get anything. So there are people also that can't take vaccines, such as people on chemotherapy or people with rare medical conditions, and they need to be protected as well. So we need that herd immunity, and herd immunity only exists if we get a buy-in from everyone else to get over that 90%. So the benefits that we as a society reap by having so many people vaccinated with such less incidence of disease is only because we vaccinate almost everybody. That's the thing. It's not that diseases are rare, so we don't need to be vaccinated. It's the fact that everyone's vaccinated. That's why these diseases are so rare. It's the reverse.
Right. I think if the claim that vaccines don't work were true, we would see a much higher child mortality, right? We would see a lot more kids getting significantly sick and ultimately passing away.
Right. And case in point, in 2009, I had a personal contact with someone who attended a religious camp in upstate New York where there was a measles outbreak where most of the people there didn't give the MMR shot. In pockets of California, years ago, there was a whooping cough outbreak, coincidentally in a pocket where people didn't give the DTP, which is diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, whooping cough. We've had measles outbreaks all over the country. We've had outbreaks right here in Florida, in pockets of areas where people don't give that meningitis, measles, or whooping cough vaccine. So we see in real time, in real areas, on real people, that once you get a clump of people or a group that's not vaccinating, whoop, the incidence of those illnesses shoots right back up immediately. So that's something parents need to be aware of. Yeah.
So I want to switch gears for just a second and talk about vaccine adverse events, right? Because there's VAERS, there's this database, which I admittedly didn't know too much about until the COVID vaccine came out, and a lot of people were sort of using the VAERS database to support not getting the COVID vaccine. So let's talk a little bit about VAERS, about how that database came to be and why we don't necessarily rely on it to make decisions regarding vaccination.
Sure. So the VAERS, the VAERS, is a vaccine adverse event reporting system. It's self-reporting, meaning anybody can just say anything. It's not checked, it's not validated, it's not verified. So basically, number one, anyone could say that anything caused anything, and it's not backed up or proven, so it's not reliable. Number two, it's kind of like when a pharmaceutical company puts a possible adverse effect on the instruction label or packet or insert on any medication, because they have to be reported if anything follows ingestion of the medicine. And the example I always give parents is, if you open up the Tylenol pamphlet or some of the other ones, it'll say broken bone or broken leg. So if you dig a little deeper into it, if you take Tylenol, then you're in a motorcycle accident and fracture your right leg or right knee, then you have the broken leg after you took the Tylenol. It wasn't that the Tylenol caused your leg to break. It was the motorcycle accident and the car that plowed into you. But it's got to be reported because it happened within a week or two after the Tylenol. So just because anything happens after you take the COVID shot or take a medicine or get any other vaccine, for sure, it doesn't mean that it caused it. This is just a self-reporting system that exists, which is hopefully there to help people be well informed. But unfortunately, in our society, it's a fountain of disinformation and misinformation for the reasons I just gave.
Yeah, I refer to it as the Wikipedia of vaccines, right? Anybody can just throw anything in there and it's up for the world to see, but there's zero validation or any kind of pressure testing that it has to go through.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. The same way I tell parents when they look at anything published on the web or internet by a PhD or MD. It's most likely some 12-year-old who's really cute, posing as an MD or PhD, having his friends build his website, putting up copy-pasted data. And it's really not verified or verifiable. It's the same thing.
Okay. All right. So we covered a lot of ground. I think this was awesome. Any other important takeaways or anything that you really want to make sure that parents know about vaccines?
Absolutely. First of all, a parent is free to ask their pediatrician if we vaccinate our own children, which of course we do. There is no parent I have ever met, physician or not, that would ever inject anything harmful into their own child. So that 100% we can stand by. The other real issue or topic to talk about in terms of vaccine safety, sometimes we're told, well, the pharmaceutical companies, the physicians, the government, it's a conspiracy, everyone's making money.
Mhm.
Well, let me tell you something. The pharmaceutical companies with their drugs and vaccines are making billions. I agree with that. I agree. We are not, as physicians, meaning there's a cost for a vaccine and then there's reimbursement. Oftentimes, the reimbursement and the cost are identical, meaning we don't really profit from most of the vaccines. And if we do, it's very little. So there's really no money or profit in vaccines. It is strictly community service to keep the kids healthy. And parents are welcome to look into it as well with that. So there's no conspiracy. The clinicians and pediatricians are not in on it. We strictly want to keep our children healthy, our own children, as well as the children we treat in our office and our communities. And vaccines are the most, if not one of the best ways to prevent illness currently in our society. And it's a luxury, it's a privilege to have so many vaccines in our country. So we should sure as heck use them and not be afraid of what we're hearing on social media or by some parent group that got their information from a forwarded Facebook email or a tweet. So I always think and thought that a parent's information source, their encyclopedia, if you will, should come directly from their pediatrician and really nowhere else. The internet is not licensed to give medical information, but the pediatrician is. So we always welcome parents to ask. We do have vaccine handouts, which answer a lot of the vaccine questions about preservatives in the vaccine hesitancy, the safety of the MMR, everything I talked about before with Dr. Wakefield's study being fraudulent. And we really just hope and expect that once a parent develops a bond and rapport with their pediatrician, they'll really trust them and they'll trust them to take care of their children like a pediatrician would take care of their own.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you again so much. This was an excellent episode.
Great, my pleasure. Happy to do it.
Make sure you like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Thank you for joining us on Kids Doc Talk.